Gears of War is the game that made me a gamer. Growing up, I was a big fan of games like Backyard Baseball and Zoo Tycoon and various N64 and PS2 games that would have ads run on Nickelodeon. But it was the original Gears of War that made me realize that video games could be more than simple, colorful distractions. They could be immersive and tell cool stories and have darker tones. And yeah, obviously Gears of War wasn't the first game to do any of those things, but it was the game that showed them to me before anyone else had a chance to. And I'm always going to have a soft spot for this franchise because of that. I played the original Gears trilogy like crazy back in the 360 days, and Gears Ultimate Edition was one of the reasons I bought an Xbox One instead of a PS4, hold your laughter. Microsoft's handling of this IP has been embarrassing, frankly, only outdone by their handling of Halo. Like, we're talking about a game that actually overtook Halo as the main reason to subscribe to Xbox Live back in the day, but here we are in 2023, almost 2024, the last mainline Gears of War game was nearly 5 years ago, and Microsoft now seemingly refuses to even acknowledge that the IP still exists, despite forming an entire studio to manage it. Granted, we saw how the, Microsoft-formed franchise studios went with 343 and Halo, but the downfall of Gears of War through the eyes of someone with a lot of personal attachment to the original trilogy has been really, really frustrating. Now, if you clicked on this video, I imagine you have at least some idea or understanding of what killed Gears of War so dead, but in case you didn't know, or you just needed a little refresher, here's a quick recap of what killed Gears of War so dead, as told by someone who took it all incredibly personally. And to avoid talking about Gears of War Judgment, we're just going to talk about what's happened since the launch of the X-Bone. So the basic cliff notes of the downfall of Gears is that while Gears 4 actually got things off on solid footing, nothing mind-blowing, but a solid understanding of what made Gears of War fun and a nice jumping off point for the future, Gears 5 completely threw everything off track, and the Coalition and Microsoft have both been seemingly uninterested in getting it back on track, as evidenced by the fact that it's been almost 5 years since Gears 5 came out, and we don't know if Gears 6 is even still coming at this point. Microsoft recently confirmed in that big roadmap that came out a few days ago that Gears of War is still, it's still a franchise that they own, it's still upcoming, but they won't give any official updates on Gears 6, they won't give any official updates on the rumored remastered collection, and the whole franchise just seems to be in complete shambles. It's been years since this massive Microsoft IP even had a presence at any of their showcases, any of their conferences. It's been years since Phil Spencer even said the words Gears of War. And frankly, I blame this entirely on Gears 5, because not only did Gears 5 have the weakest campaign gameplay to date, largely because of the decision to make it half sandbox for some bizarre reason, but the story also pissed a lot of people off with its handling of established characters and lore. The state of Gears of War post Gears 5 reminds me a lot of the state that the Star Wars community was in during the wait between Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker. Because, regardless of how you feel about The Last Jedi, it did pretty irreversible damage to the rules of the franchise and the way that certain characters were portrayed. And no matter how Rise of Skywalker decided to follow up on it, it was going to be messy. And Gears 6 is now in a similar situation. No matter how they choose to follow up on Gears 5, they're going to have to answer some really awkward questions, and they're questions that nobody really wants answered in the first place, but you can't avoid them because that's how far off the rails Gears 5 went. And this is also not even mentioning the fact that the longer the conflict of Gears 4, 5, 6, the longer that central conflict of the story continues, the more it degrades and just devalues the ending of the original trilogy. It is the classic example of a story that is so desperate to connect itself to the original trilogy that it's now making the original trilogy not special simply by existing, which, spoiler alert, is not the way to get old school fans to like your new game. Why is this franchise so scared of telling new stories with new characters in new time periods? A report started making its way around the internet recently about Cliff Bleszinski, the director of the original trilogy, basically saying he thinks the series needs a full reset in the same vein as the 2018 God of War game, and frankly, I wholeheartedly agree. The damage done to the established Gears of War fanbase, story, gameplay formula, it's arguably irreversible at this point, and this is one of the few instances where I actually welcome a full back-to-basics reset instead of trying to course correct with a sequel. And that's not to say a Gears reboot would have to completely reset the timeline, but rather just take us to a completely different part of it. Give your gameplay the excuse to get back to basics and get away from all the weird pseudo-sandbox ideas that the last game had, and tell a simpler story that demands simpler gameplay that is more akin to the original series. Why not shoot us back to the Pendulum Wars? Or why not have us follow a new cast of characters during the early days of the war against the Locust? Or better yet, why not do a Halo Reach style story and have us play through Emergence Day, or play in the events up to Emergence Day? Why did you take over a franchise with really expansive lore if you absolutely refuse to use the lore? One of the defining traits of Gears of War back in the day was the dark and borderline nihilistic tone of the first two games. The third game kind of turned the heel into being a big bombastic action adventure, but those first two Gears games are extremely dark, and I'm not sure why none of the future games ever went back to that. And that also made the more, explosive and bombastic tone of Gears 3 feel more deserved because of all the dark shit we had to go through to get to this big epic conclusion, or it was fucking supposed to be a conclusion. There's certain sections of the first Gears of War that feel straight out of a horror game. I'll always remember that section in the campaign. It's like an hour-ish in where you encounter the wretches for the first time, and it's the middle of the night, it's pouring rain, and then eventually you make your way inside for shelter, and it's super claustrophobic and genuinely unsettling, especially when you start finding the remains of the people who were there before the wretches got to them. Like, that whole sequence is so effective for building this world. Like, that mission, I can't remember the name of it, I'll find it and I'll put the name of the mission on screen right now. Gears of War 2 was more action-oriented and a bit lighter on the, slower, more tense moments like that, but the tone of the story and the writing was still extremely bleak, and that's part of what made the series unique. Like, yeah, you're playing as dudes who look like the fucking Rescue Heroes action figures, but the game also makes sure that you understand they're like that, because if they're not like that, the shitty fucking world they live in will kill them. So yeah, it's kind of funny when the main characters stand next to the normal civilians and it looks like Marcus is just thinking about eating them, but then you start seeing what the Locusts do to the normal-sized people, and suddenly it's completely understandable why everything is the way it is in this universe, and it's completely understandable that these guys are built like rescue heroes, because if they're not, they will die immediately and horrifically. Gears of War lost its way when the enemies you fought stopped being intimidating in context, and I don't actually think that's something that can be re-established now that it's gone. So fuck it, do a series reboot, Get the dark tone back, get us some new characters so we can see this fucked up world from new perspectives, bring back the horror influence, and for the love of God, make the Locusts scary again. Fighting robots is not exciting or scary because robots are boring. Fighting the Swarm is not exciting or scary because the Swarm are just the Locust but boring. Fighting the Locust was exciting and occasionally scary because the threat they posed to the world we inhabited was well established because it was shown to us. And yeah, you can say the story in Gears doesn't matter as long as the gameplay is fun, but I think Gears 5 is evidence that story is much more important to this franchise than people realize, because without the cool story and unique world, Gears is just another third-person cover shooter, of which there are many these days. The original trilogy stood out because not only was it a third-person cover shooter at the time when those weren't really around every corner, but it also had a dark tone and gritty presentation. Gears 4 and 5 ditched the dark tone and gritty presentation, so now all it's got is the standard third-person cover shooting that it's been using since Gears 1, and it's just not enough anymore. And on top of that, it shows a gross misunderstanding of what people liked this series for in the first place. It wasn't just that it was a co-op third-person shooter. It wasn't just that it had a gun with a chainsaw on it. It wasn't just that there was the wave-based bonus mode. It was all of those things, plus the tone and universe and presentation, all of which have been completely left behind in favor of just focusing on the fact that it's a co-op third-person shooter with chainsaw guns and a wave-based bonus mode. Again, it's just not enough anymore. At this point, I absolutely welcome a complete reboot of Gears of War. Again, you don't have to erase the timeline or anything. You don't have to never go back to the established characters. But it's time to tell a new story in this universe and get back to the tone and style that made this series popular in the first place. Get back to the darker, more horror-inspired tone of the original, and bring back the conflict between the humans and Locust. There is so much to be done with that. And in the meantime, for fuck's sake, release Gears 2 and 3 on PC. What are you waiting for?